4 college students went to bed in their home on a quiet Sunday night, and by dawn, 3 were found stabbed to death in their beds, while 2 roommates survived in a house soaked in blood they never heard coming. November 13th, 2022. Moscow, Idaho. What started as a normal college weekend ended in one of the most brutal crimes in recent memory. For University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were butchered in their sleep by a stranger who moved through their house like a ghost. But here's what will shock you most. The 2 surviving roommates slept through the entire massacre, waking up hours later to discover their friends' lifeless bodies. For 7 weeks, the whole country watched as police had no suspects, no weapon, and no clear motive. Then they arrested someone nobody saw coming, a PhD criminology student who had been studying how to commit the perfect crime. This is the complete story of how Bryan Kohberger turned from student to monster, and how 2 young women survived the most terrifying night of their lives. Bryan Christopher Kohberger seemed like the last person you'd expect to commit mass murder. Born in 1994 in Pennsylvania, he was the youngest of 5 children in a middle-class family. His father worked as a maintenance worker, his mother as a paraprofessional at an elementary school. By all accounts, they were a normal, loving family. But even in his teenage years, there were signs that something was different about Bryan. Classmates remember him as socially awkward, obsessively interested in true crime, and unusually focused on understanding the psychology of criminals. While other kids were playing sports or dating, Bryan was reading about serial offenders and studying forensic science. After high school, Bryan enrolled at DeSales University in Pennsylvania, where he studied criminal justice and psychology. His professors remember him as an intelligent but intense student who seemed almost too interested in the darker aspects of criminology. He wrote papers analyzing criminal behavior, studying how investigations worked, and examining what made certain crimes go unsolved. But here's the first twist that changes everything. While Bryan was studying how to catch criminals, he was allegedly planning to become one himself. In 2022, Bryan enrolled in the PhD criminology program at Washington State University in Pullman, just 10 miles from the University of Idaho campus in Moscow. He was studying under professors who specialized in criminal behavior and forensic psychology. His research focused on understanding how emotions and psychological factors influenced criminal decision-making. What nobody realized was that Bryan wasn't just studying criminal psychology academically. He was allegedly using his education to plan the perfect crime. The house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, looked like any other college rental property. It was a large, 3-story home shared by 6 University of Idaho students. The layout would become crucial to understanding how the crimes unfolded that night. On the 3rd floor lived Kaylee Goncalves, 21, and Madison Mogen, 21. They had been best friends since 6th grade, inseparable through high school and college. Kaylee had recently graduated, but returned to Moscow frequently to visit friends, and had planned to move to Texas for a job. That weekend, she came back to show Madison her new Range Rover. The 2nd floor housed Xana Kernodle, 20, a junior studying marketing, and Dylan Mortensen, one of the surviving roommates. Xana's boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, 20, was spending the night in her room. Ethan was a freshman studying recreation, sport, and tourism management, known for his infectious smile and love of outdoor activities. On the 1st floor lived Bethany Funk, the other surviving roommate, a junior studying communications. On the night of November 12th, 2022, the 6 roommates were living their normal college lives, completely unaware that someone was watching them, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Kaylee and Madison spent the evening at a local bar called the Corner Club, then went to a food truck downtown around 1:40 a.m. Security footage showed them laughing, talking to the food truck workers, acting like typical college students on a weekend night. They returned home around 1:45 a.m. Xana and Ethan had attended a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity earlier that evening. They returned to the house around 1:45 a.m. as well, going directly to Xana's 2nd floor bedroom. Dylan and Bethany had been out separately that night and returned home at different times. Both went to their respective bedrooms, Dylan on the 2nd floor, Bethany on the 1st floor. By 2 a.m., all 6 housemates were in the house, settling in for what they thought would be a normal night's sleep. But someone else was watching the house, waiting for the lights to go out, planning their next moves with the precision of someone who had studied exactly how to commit the perfect crime. Here's where the story takes its most chilling turn. At approximately 4 a.m. on November 13, 2022, a masked intruder entered the house through a sliding door on the second floor. What happened next would become one of the most brutal crimes in Idaho's history. The killer moved with shocking efficiency and silence. Using what investigators later determined was a large military-style knife, the attacker first went to the third floor where Kaylee and Madison were sleeping together in Madison's room. Both young women were attacked while they slept, suffering multiple stab wounds. The medical examiner later determined that they were likely asleep when the attack began and died quickly from their injuries. The violence was so swift and shocking that they had no opportunity to scream or call for help. The killer then moved to the second floor, where Xana and Ethan were in Xana's bedroom. Unlike the third-floor victims, Xana and Ethan may have been awakened by the sounds from upstairs. Evidence suggests they attempted to fight back, but they were overpowered and killed with the same brutal efficiency. During this attack, Dylan Mortensen was awakened by what she later described as unusual sounds coming from other parts of the house. At first, she thought it might be her roommates moving around or perhaps sounds from outside the house. But then she heard something that chilled her to the bone, what sounded like crying or whimpering coming from Xana's room, followed by a male voice saying something she couldn't quite make out. Dylan opened her bedroom door to investigate and saw a figure in black clothing and a mask walking toward the sliding door exit. The figure appeared to be a young man, not very tall, with bushy eyebrows. He walked right past her line of sight without seeing her. Terrified and in shock, Dylan retreated to her room, locked the door, and waited. She was too frightened to call 911 immediately, later explaining that she thought she might be experiencing a nightmare or that the sounds were part of some college prank or party activity. Meanwhile, Bethany Funk, sleeping on the first floor, heard nothing. The killer had somehow managed to murder 4 people on the floors above her without waking her up. The most shocking aspect of the crime was its surgical precision. The killer knew exactly how to move through the house, which rooms to target, and how to avoid detection by the surviving roommates. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random break-in gone wrong. This appeared to be carefully planned and executed by someone with extensive knowledge of criminal investigations. Hours passed. Dylan remained locked in her room, too terrified to emerge. Bethany slept through the night, unaware of the horror that had unfolded above her. It wasn't until nearly 11:58 a.m. on November 13th that Dylan finally called 911. But even then, the call wasn't initially about a murder. She reported an unconscious person because she couldn't process what she was actually seeing. When police arrived, they discovered a scene so horrific that even veteran officers were shaken. 4 young people, all in their early 20s, had been brutally stabbed to death in their beds. The amount of blood was staggering, and the violence was unlike anything local law enforcement had ever encountered. The investigation that followed became one of the most intense and scrutinized criminal investigations in recent memory. Moscow, Idaho, is a small college town of about 25,000 people where serious violent crime is almost non-existent. The police department had never handled a quadruple homicide, and they quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond their normal expertise. The FBI was called in immediately, along with the Idaho State Police. The crime scene was so complex and the evidence so extensive that investigators spent days processing every inch of the house, trying to understand exactly what had happened and who could have committed such a calculated and brutal crime. Here's what made this case so particularly terrifying. The killer had left very little evidence behind. There were no clear fingerprints, no DNA immediately visible to investigators, no obvious witnesses except for Dylan's brief glimpse of a masked figure. The weapon was never found. There was no clear motive, no obvious connection between the victims and any potential suspect. For 7 weeks, the entire country watched as police seemed to have no leads, no suspects, and no clear direction for their investigation. The case dominated national news, social media speculation ran wild, and the surviving roommates faced intense scrutiny and even harassment from people who couldn't understand how they had slept through such a violent crime. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: genetic genealogy and digital forensics. Investigators had found a small amount of DNA at the crime scene on a knife sheath left behind by the killer. Using advanced genetic analysis techniques, they were able to create a profile and trace it through public genealogy databases. The DNA led them to Bryan Kohberger. But the genetic evidence was just the beginning. When investigators started examining Bryan's digital footprint, they discovered a pattern of behavior that was both shocking and terrifying. Cell phone data revealed that Bryan had been near the victim's house at least 12 times before the night of the murders, always late at night or early in the morning, always circling the area in a pattern that suggested surveillance rather than casual visits. His academic background made the case even more chilling. Here was a PhD student in criminology who understood exactly how criminal investigations worked, who had studied forensic evidence collection, who knew what mistakes criminals typically made that led to their capture. Bryan had allegedly used his academic knowledge to try to commit what he believed would be the perfect crime. He studied how DNA evidence worked, how cell phone data could be tracked, how investigations were conducted. But ironically, it was his own academic preparation that created some of the evidence that eventually led to his arrest. On December 30th, 2022, exactly 7 weeks after the murders, Bryan Kohberger was arrested at his family home in Pennsylvania. The arrest sent shockwaves through both the academic and law enforcement communities. How could a PhD student studying criminal justice have committed such a horrific crime? The evidence against Bryan was overwhelming once investigators started piecing it together. His cell phone had been turned off during the hours of the murders, a clear attempt to avoid digital tracking. His white Hyundai Elantra matched witness descriptions of a suspicious vehicle seen in the area. Most damaging of all, his DNA matched the profile found on the knife sheath at the crime scene. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence was found in Bryan's apartment and academic work. Police discovered essays he had written analyzing criminal behavior, research papers on how investigations are conducted, and digital searches related to the Idaho murders case that began shortly after the crimes were committed. The psychological profile that emerged was of someone who had become obsessed with the idea of committing the perfect crime, someone who believed his academic knowledge would make him untouchable by law enforcement. The legal process that followed was lengthy and complex. Bryan initially maintained his innocence, with his defense team arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that he was being targeted because of his academic background and unusual research interests. But as more evidence emerged during the investigation, the case against him became increasingly ironclad. Phone records, DNA evidence, digital forensics, and behavioral analysis all pointed to Bryan as the killer. The impact on the surviving roommates was devastating and long-lasting. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk became central figures in one of the most publicized criminal cases of the decade, facing intense media scrutiny, online harassment, and survivors' guilt that continues to affect their lives. In victim impact statements read during Bryan's sentencing hearing, both surviving roommates described the ongoing trauma they experience. Dylan spoke about nightmares, anxiety, and the guilt of not being able to save her friends. Bethany described feeling like she was living in a constant state of fear and hypervigilance. The families of the victims have also struggled with unimaginable grief. Kaylee's father, Steve Goncalves, became a vocal advocate for justice, frequently speaking to media and pushing for transparency in the investigation. The families of Madison, Xana, and Ethan each spoke about the promising young lives that were cut short and the devastating impact on their extended families. On July 2nd, 2025, in a surprising turn of events, Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The plea deal meant he would avoid the death penalty, but would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. On July 23, 2025, Bryan was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years for burglary. Judge Stephen Hippler acknowledged that Kohberger's motive may never be fully understood, but the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. The case revealed disturbing insights about how academic knowledge of criminal justice could be perverted and weaponized by someone with violent intentions. Bryan's professors and classmates were shocked to learn that someone they had worked with academically was capable of such horrific violence. The Idaho murders case also highlighted the vulnerability of college students living off campus and the importance of campus safety measures. The University of Idaho implemented new security protocols and support services for students dealing with trauma and anxiety related to the case. Both surviving roommates described in their victim impact statements how they had been viciously harassed and inundated with death threats in the aftermath of the murders, showing how victims of crime can be further traumatized by public attention and social media speculation. The investigation itself became a model for how modern law enforcement agencies can use advanced forensic techniques, genetic genealogy, and digital forensics to solve complex crimes. The FBI's involvement and the coordination between multiple agencies showed how serious violent crimes require extensive resources and expertise. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadle, and Ethan Chapin, the sentencing brought some measure of closure, but the pain of their loss continues. These were young people with bright futures, loving families, and dreams that were violently cut short by someone who saw them not as human beings, but as subjects for his twisted criminal experiment. The house at 1122 King Road, where 4 young lives were ended so brutally, has since been demolished. The University of Idaho purchased the property and decided that the building was too much of a painful reminder for the community to remain standing. But the impact of what happened in that house on November 13, 2022, continues to reverberate. It changed how we think about campus safety, academic ethics, and the responsibility of educational institutions when they train people who have access to dangerous knowledge. Bryan Kohberger will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the questions about what drove him to commit such horrific acts may never be fully answered. What we do know is that 4 promising young lives were lost. 2 young women survived an unimaginable trauma, and an entire community was forever changed by one person's decision to turn academic knowledge into deadly action. The case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind education, intelligence, and academic credentials, and that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand exactly how the system works and believe they can outsmart it. For Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, the healing process continues. They survived the most terrifying night imaginable, and their courage in testifying and facing their trauma publicly has helped ensure that justice was served for their 4 friends who didn't make it through that night. The Idaho murders will be remembered as one of the most shocking crimes of the 21st century, not just for their brutality, but for the chilling reminder that sometimes the people we trust to study and understand crime are the same ones capable of committing it.